Hey everyone, my name is Fluxtrance and I'm collaborating with Paradox Interactive to bring you the third part in my map making series for City Skylines. Today's episode departs from the basics of map making as we narrow our focus and take a look at how to create realistic mountains in the map editor. This episode, and the next two following it, put much more emphasis on terraforming in particular, so if you haven't seen my first two map making episodes, I definitely recommend giving those a watch first. Now, before diving straight into terraforming, it's a good idea to first identify the type of mountains you're trying to replicate. I like to head over to Google Maps, flip on the satellite view, and use the control key to pan around a little bit, just to get a feel for the topology that we're going for. Now, certain regions vary in the way their mountains form and erode over time, and replicating these patterns is a great way to add that extra bit of realism to any environment you happen to be working in. So, back in game, the first thing to note is the map height limit. I find it helpful to start by pulling some of the terrain to the maximum height in the area you expect to have the tallest peak. Now from here, mark some of the areas that'll sit at the absolute lowest point, typically the ocean floor or the bottom of a river. This will give you a good idea of how you need to distribute different elements in between to make your mountains as convincing as possible within the height constraints. Now your first instinct might be to try to raise the terrain in such a way that you form mountains, trying to shape the varying topology as you go. But I think, given all the detail and variance in the ridges and crevices, that this method can be a little overwhelming and difficult to pull off. Instead, I like to first look at the most basic shape of the peak, and then as we develop finer and finer details, we'll get a fractal-like pattern similar to the way runoff erodes these peaks in the real world. Try starting by pulling the terrain up as you move down the side of the mountains to form the definitive ridges. In the case of deeper valleys and stark cliff faces, you may also want to pull some terrain back in by right-clicking with the pull tool. Once the basic shape is in place, try right-clicking with the flattening tool along the sides of the ridges and valleys to get a nice clean edge. You may also find a second pass on the ridge and valley with the pull tool set to a smaller brush size can sharpen these edges even more, and this will give us a nice starting point before moving into the finer details. Once this is done, you can treat each ridge as its own peak and repeat the process by creating, again, little ridges and smaller elements, and flattening and smoothing, and doing the same thing over again in a fractal-like pattern. I find it helpful to imagine the path runoff would take as it cascades down the mountain, and carve accordingly. Now you'll notice as we reach the midsection in the mountain, the branching ridges tend to level out more and become much smoother. In these areas, try using a little less aggressive ridging techniques to keep more of the basic flattened shape. You'll also notice, depending on the map theme you're using, that there's a certain threshold for exposing the rock texture. I like to try and keep my foothills gradual enough that the rock is no longer exposed after a certain point, and this will sort of serve as the marker for where the tree line should be. If you really want to make your mountain peaks pop, I've also found that doing less and less refinement on the edge of the ridges and valleys can yield a much more blended look as we move into the foothills. Sometimes near the very bottom of the foothills, I'll even take it a step further and dither the ridges by running them over with the smooth tool. And as you can see, just by adjusting our workflow, we've worked with the fractal nature of mountains to create pretty realistic looking mountains. You may find that mountains in other regions take on slightly different shapes, but following the same fractal principles with a slightly adjusted technique can yield similarly realistic results. I really love this method of making mountains, and with a little practice, you'll find that you can just sit back, throw on some music, and get yourself in the terraforming zone. It's honestly pretty therapeutic. And finally, after adding in some foliage, you can see that this little cluster of mountains really came together. While this might be one of my most used methods for terraforming, we'll definitely be covering some other techniques you might find useful in other situations in a future video. At the end of the day, the biggest factor in how good your end result looks is really just time. While we ended up with some pretty good looking mountains in this short demo, maps I've made in the past like Tomku Wilderness usually take 40 to 50 hours to complete. It's really all about patience, and you can see in comparison just how much better the end result looks with a little more time spent. With all that said, that pretty much wraps up our mountain making tutorial. I hope you found some of these tips helpful. Be sure to subscribe here for more tutorials like this one, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.